You're listening to the Save the Marriage podcast. Your marriage can be saved and strengthened if you have the right information. Join Dr. Lee Baucom as he explores ways for you to improve your relationship and your life, starting right now.
Hey, this is Lee Baucom, and this is the Save the Marriage podcast. This is the podcast that I designed to help you save and restore your marriage no matter where it is, no matter how bad it's gotten. Now, obviously, you're going to need at some point for your spouse to step into this process. And so part of what I've designed this podcast to be is about helping you get an understanding so that you can continue moving forward with your efforts and stay in that process. Now, one of the things you may notice is I don't have ads on this podcast. This is a podcast that I put out because I believe this to be very important. And if you're wondering what's behind that, it is the Save the Marriage system. So a lot of people have listened to my podcast and they're like, okay, great. I understand. I've listened to your podcast, but I don't know what to do now. The answer to that is grab the system. The reason is because that system gives you the understanding of what has happened in your marriage and how to begin to turn it around. And yes, even if your spouse is resisting your efforts. And part of what we want to talk about today is how you might get yourself into trouble because you're working on this by yourself. So first of all, I'm going to assume in this podcast that you are working by yourself on restoring the marriage. Not only that you have a spouse that is, for whatever reason, resistant to the possibility of restoring this marriage, at least right now. Now, as I said earlier, at some point, we have to bridge that gap and get to a new place. But there are some mistakes I see along the way. There are 5 that I want to talk about today, 5 mistakes that people make in the process. And some of these have some overlap to them, but they are 5 different mistakes that you might make in your efforts to get there. Now, after I give you those 5, I'm going to suggest a couple of things that you could start doing. Now, I am also going to end up by telling you that the big start is to grab the system. So again, visit me at savethemarriage.com. That's savethemarriage.com. But let's go ahead and talk about those 5 big mistakes that people make in their efforts to save their marriage. So first one is stop pressuring. This is one where, we find ourselves at that place. And so let's back up for a minute and recognize that when a marriage is in trouble, it is both scary and painful. And the painful part is because we as humans are wired for this connection. We're wired for having these relationships. And because marriage is the number one connection in adult life, it's particularly painful when that connection is failing. And so one of the tendencies that we have is to try to pressure back to get that attention. And so a lot of times this is when you are pushing for attention. You want to go on date night or go on that, big trip or bring big presents to try to win them back. And that's pressure. That's pressuring the situation, usually beyond what the situation can handle, because it's likely that you've had a lot of disconnect in your relationship. If you haven't heard me talk about it, I describe this as the pause button marriage. And by that, I mean that somewhere after you got married, you kind of hit the pause button to take on life, right? You took on, whether it's kids and waiting for them to get to a certain point of development, or whether it's your job and trying to get to that point where you've made it, or trying to make sure you've, covered the hobbies while you're young, or find the friends and do all those other things that life is calling for you, knowing that you're going to, in your mind, get back to the marriage at some point down the road. So you hit the pause button, which unfortunately, there is no pause button for marriage. You hit it, but it doesn't do what you think. It doesn't put it into suspended animation. It puts it on a course of declining and disconnection and pain. And so part of what happens when someone suddenly realizes that there is a problem is that they kind of reverse engines and they start pressing for attention. So the pressure that comes with that is often what causes more problems. One of the things that often happens that I watch is that people start, finding ways. Let's do this together. Let's do that together. Can we, work on this? Can we work on that? And so all of that ends up being a pressuring situation for your spouse who isn't used to the level of intensity of the relationship, and B is also hurting from what's happened, and so they're resisting the process. They're resisting the efforts to restore things. So you don't want to pressure your spouse. Now, if you're thinking, going, well, I don't know what else to do, we're going to get to that after we go through those other four. So first one, stop pressuring. Don't push for attention. Don't push your spouse for action on working on the relationship. I know that feels counterintuitive, but I can tell you, having watched this over and over, if you do that, what you create is distancing by your spouse. Okay, the second thing to stop doing is stop blaming and shaming. This is one that I see very frequently where, so somebody's been trying to get attention and they've been trying to get some action, and the spouse is going, nope, I don't see a way forward. I don't feel like there's anything here. And so suddenly they go from pressuring for attention to blaming the other person for not wanting to work on it, blaming the spouse, right? And they talk about how bad the person is in subtle ways, little insults along the way. How could you do this? We made promises. We made a commitment. I can't believe you would turn your back on us, on me, on the family. There's a lot of blaming and shaming. If you had only done these things, we wouldn't be at this situation. So you have to stop doing that. Now, let me tell you kind of a little thing that I've noticed along the way, and that is this thing about hope. Humans don't do well with no hope. It's kind of wired in us to try to find some place of having hope and holding hope. And so one of the things that I see in a pattern in the relationship is that a spouse at some point loses hope in the possibility of this relationship working. So there's a loss of hope. And then there's a rebuilding of hope that is often for something else, whether it's another person or just being single or going to another location or taking a job somewhere else or being independent. There's something that begins to be their loci of hope, their focus of that point, right? They're looking out there and going, that is what would give me hope. And so unfortunately, you're going to feel that acutely. And so when you see them going, no, I want to do this, I want to have this other relationship, or I want to separate, or it's a tendency to want to put a little blame on them for not seeing the importance of the relationship that's there. But I want you to notice what happened right before that. They lost hope. And when we lose hope, if we're there very long, it is completely destructive to our life. And so we have to find some hope someplace. Now, I want you to notice something that we've already set up here. If you lose hope and can change hope to somewhere else, you can also lose hope in that possibility and return hope somewhere else. And that's the process that we're going to get to, but you can't do it by blaming and shaming them. You also can't do it by the pressuring that we talked about before. Okay, so no pressuring, no blaming and shaming. Then you've also got to stop trying to convince, stop convincing. I see this come out from people that, a spouse says, I don't see a way that I can stay married. I think I want out of this marriage. And the person immediately goes, oh, let me show you this information. And it might be my system. It might be one of my books. It might be somebody else's book or somebody else's program or a video or something from their faith background or something that is an attempt to get them to see things differently, right? There's a convincing component to that. And so I also watch as people kind of debate their spouse. This is what I talk about as the relationship talk. The relationship talk, and a lot of people have heard me say that and think I mean don't talk about your relationship, but what I say is don't have the relationship talk. And the relationship talk is when you have your talking points in your head, right? If you remember back to maybe if you were on a debate team in high school and you set up your arguments, and you're ready for the answers that the other team gives, and you've got your evidence, and you're building your case, right? That's what all that's about. That's really great in a debate situation because there's somebody who's going to choose the winner. But in this one, you're trying to debate your spouse, trying to out-convince them of what they've already begun to feel. And here's the problem. That creates hardened positions. The more you try to convince somebody to see it differently than they're seeing it, the more strongly they will hold to how they're already seeing it. It's just human nature. So as you're working hard to convince them by showing them a book or debating them with your points or even blaming and shaming them and trying to pressure them into having that connection, all you're doing is causing them to harden their position that there is no way forward. And so as you're trying to convince them, they are in essence, they may be trying to convince you of the other side, right? But in essence, they're convincing themselves of the opposite, that they can't see a way forward. So a little psychological theory, way back in the 60s, 1960s, so all the way last century, there was a theory that has proven the test of time of psychological reactance. Now, psychological reactance is the theory that even if something is good for you, if you feel like somebody is pushing it onto you and therefore pulling away something that you hold dear, some freedom that you feel you have, you will resist it. So think about talking to, a child or a teenager, and you're trying to help them navigate some tough points, right? And so you're trying to give them information to not make mistakes for the best of their life, right? So you're trying for the best reasons to make them see the dangers of their actions, but in essence, they're feeling that as you're trying to control them. You're taking away some freedom. And so they go the opposite way. This is true in society too. Forget it being children and teens. It happens in adults. You can say, hey, this would be really, really good for you, but if they feel like you are pressuring them and it would take away some other freedom that they're holding on to, they are going to push against it and reject it for maybe rational or irrational reasons, but they are going to push against it and build their case against it. So part of what often happens is in your efforts to convince, they more deeply convince themselves of what they have decided, what they have found hope in, to go back to that prior point. Okay, so no pressuring, no blaming and shaming, no convincing. The next one to stop doing is arguing and fighting. I know it's hard, right? Because when you feel like somebody is seeing things so differently, it's easy to get into a tug of war with them. In fact, I think it's almost another piece of human nature. And there are so many times when you think that you are having the argument for the best of reasons, but what you're doing is injecting conflict into the relationship. And whenever we inject conflict into the relationship, what we're doing is verifying for that person that this relationship is in trouble, because look at all the anger and animosity and conflict between you. It must be wrong. So if we're in the midst of arguing and fighting about these things, what it creates is a reactivity and an anger cycle that begins to grow. And as anger grows, if it's not resolved, if there's no way to resolve it between you, it becomes deeply seated resentment. And in that resentment, they come to pull away even further. So while you think you're fighting for the marriage, it ends up being fighting against your spouse, and they pull away further. Sometimes it is more helpful to try to understand their perspective and say, I understand where you're coming from. That's not where I am right now, but I understand that's where you feel right now. Just to leave it at that instead of trying to fight against what they see. Now, I know that when they are posing different things that you find to believe to be not true about your relationship, it's easy to get drawn into it. So you have to be very cautious to not get sucked into that. So stop arguing and fighting. The last thing is stop tricking. And maybe you haven't done this yet. So if If you haven't started, don't start. But if you are doing this, stop. And what I mean by tricking is looking for the tricks along the way, the little hints and tricks that seem to proliferate on the internet and other places of ways of manipulating your spouse, of changing their mind. Many times it's like reverse psychology, or you might have heard of the no contact rule that is a big failure, or neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, or some other little way of tricking them, doing what they might describe it as mental jujitsu, right? Of pinning them down. Now, I've done jujitsu. There's nothing wrong with jujitsu. The problem is what they're teaching you is not that. It is manipulation. And your spouse will catch on to it very quickly. And once they catch on, you have lost even more of their faith and trust. Reverse psychology may work on a 5-year-old who doesn't want to eat their broccoli and you're trying to convince them of it, but it doesn't work on an adult. And if it does, it won't last long. Another one, the no contact rule, is somehow trying to make them jealous and come begging back to you by having zero contact. I want you to understand that relationships are built in connection, of deepening the connection. And so if you go to no contact, it's a 30-day process. What you find at the end of 30 days is that you have proven that you are out of the relationship. Not that you're trying to rebuild it. Why would you rebuild a relationship by having nothing to do with the person that you want to build that relationship with? It just doesn't make sense, except for the people who are telling you about it are manipulating you. They're tricking you, as are the people who are trying to get you to do reverse psychology. So if you're falling into that, stop. If you haven't, avoid it. Okay, so those are the big ones that you want to make sure that you avoid. Big 5, stop pressuring, stop blaming or shaming, stop convincing, stop arguing and fighting, and stop tricking. And if you haven't, then avoid pressuring, avoid blaming and shaming, avoid convincing, avoid arguing and fighting, and avoid tricking. Don't fall into those traps. They will do more damage to your relationship, and I rarely see that they gain any benefit. Okay, so those are the stops, 5 big stops. So what do you do? What do you start? Well, let me suggest several things. 3. One is to invite connection. You're not pressuring someone to connect with you. You're not pressuring them by blaming them and shaming them and trying to convince them to work on it. You're not arguing them into trying to spend time with you. You're not trying to trick them into that. You're trying to invite connection. So when you invite connection, it is saying, hey, I'm here, right? So if you think about how you would invite connection, it's smaller things in the beginning, the small actions you can take that build over time. So invite connection as a bridge point to get from your disconnected place to a more connected place. When you invite somebody, they have the capacity of turning it down at that moment without it being the last chance. That's like the trickery stuff, right? You invite them in a way that allows you to invite them again. And so those possibilities are there. Second thing to do is choose growth, your growth. That is one thing that you have absolute control of, working at where you become stagnant, of looking at where you become stuck, and of rebuilding those pieces in your process, of becoming more and more of who you need to be, of how you want to show up, of how you want to be your best self in the world. Now, let me be honest. I don't know you. I'm not saying there's something wrong with you. I do know this. Adults stagnate their growth process. We get to a place and we kind of lock it in. And so we get into our routines and we end up in a place of being stuck. Now, years ago, I had a guy that was in my office and he says, my wife keeps saying I've changed. I need you to tell her I haven't changed. And I said, if you haven't changed, that's too bad. You've missed an opportunity. Maybe what she's saying is the way you've been changing is not a way that she sees into the relationship. But change is important. So choose growth. And the last thing is hold hope. While a spouse may be in the midst of either losing hope in your marriage or gaining hope in something else, you need to hold hope in working on the relationship. So back to the 80s. I went to the 60s for one theory. Now back to the 1980s. There is a theory that creates this idea of what hope includes, and it's the hope formula. So the hope formula includes just three pieces to equal hope. Okay, you have to, in order to have hope, you have to know where you want to go. You have to know a way to get there, and you have to have a willingness to do the work, to get there, right? So knowing where you want to go, what do you want to do? Hold on to the hope of trying to restore and rebuild your marriage to one that you would both treasure. Holding on to hope of becoming the best person you can be and moving in that direction, okay? So those are the goals you would have. The second piece is knowing how to get there. Let me set that aside for a minute, because the third piece is being willing to do the work. You're listening to a podcast on how to save your marriage. That tells me that you have willingness to work on that. So part of what we need to do, if you've got the willingness to go in that direction, is to make sure you understand how to do it. And the way to do it is what I talk about in my system, the Save the Marriage system. Now, I will tell you a couple of extra pieces. If you go ahead and grab my system right now, I also have a free week of VIP. Now, it's possible you'll get to the page and that will be shut down because I have too many people in it. It's a limited one. I don't force this on you. It is entirely optional. You don't have to add it, but I'm giving you a week free if you go ahead and sign up for it. So after you make the purchase of the system, I will offer you a free week. You can turn me down or accept it. That's the two options. It's a one-time, no-cost, one-week trial of that. Okay, so you have to sign up for it. Now, I'm not going to sign people up when things they don't know about. I don't do that. I'm not about tricking. I am about trying to provide the resources. So do that. The second thing is I do offer a get started session with one of my coaches. No cost, no obligation. Just making sure that you have the resources and you are taking advantage of that. You sign up for that on your download page after you have made the purchase and gone through that process. It's the download page where you make that request. So, and by the way, that also may have to close down if we get too many people coming in at one time. We'd have to restrict that and close it down just because of the limits we have on our staffing. So right now, those are open. And I suggest you take advantage of those things because right now you may be the one holding hope and you're the one who is choosing growth and you're the one who needs to decide how to invite connection. And by the way, I have a whole part of my VIP program that gives you specific tools of how to invite connection little by little and build to where you want to get to. So stop the pressuring, stop the blaming and shaming, stop the convincing, stop the arguing and fighting, stop the tricking, or avoid going in that direction if you haven't already. Work on inviting connection, work on choosing growth, work on holding hope, and let us help you at SaveTheMarriage.com. That's SaveTheMarriage.com. This is Lee Baucom wishing you the best as you work to save your marriage.
You've been listening to Save the Marriage podcast. For more information and help, please visit us at SaveTheMarriage.com.